Highlighting the failings in public housing, the New York City Housing Authority has more than 35% of their tenants that aren't paying rent. And it's going to cost them more than $40 billion to bring all of their units up to date. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting topic for you today, and it's going over the problems with socialized housing. And the New York City Housing Authority is the perfect example of what can go wrong when they try to basically turn all of housing over to the government. Okay, the government doesn't know what they're doing. They're not landlords. They don't know how to make repairs. And you know what, when they artificially kept the price of the rents low, the result is going to be obvious. The buildings are not kept up to date. Okay, the people there are living in squalor. And you know what, the New York City Housing Authority is every single year ranked as the worst landlord within the city. Okay, and that's telling you something right there, okay? You should not be surprised at all that this sort of thing is failing because it's socialized housing. The government does not know how to be a landlord, and they should be out of the landlord business completely. But they keep this thing rolling as though it's a good idea, and you and I, we both know that it's not, okay? So we need to have private landlords. We need to have development. We need to get rid of these rent control systems. We need to get government out of our business. And I've been saying this as long as I've been in the real estate business, okay? So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Do you think it's a good idea for the government to be in the housing business? Do you think that the government is the best ones to operate to keep rents and prices low? Or do you think, like I do, that the government is actually causing and making the problems worse with all of their stupid policies? Okay? You know, they put these ridiculous policies in place and they can't even abide by them themselves, okay? Part of the reason that the New York City Housing Authority is only collecting rents from 65% of the people living there is because of the stupid pandemic eviction protections that the city itself put in place. Oh man, this is ridiculous. But anyway, let me get into this article because it's quite interesting. This article is coming from the New York Times, and it says, as thousands fall behind on rent, public housing faces disaster. Yeah, and you know, I don't usually quote articles from the New York Times because they're usually behind a paywall, but fortunately, this article for some reason was open for me to view. So let's get into it. It's been years since public housing in New York City has received enough money from the government to deal with the aging buildings, spotty heating systems, malfunctioning elevators, rats, and more that have made it an emblem of neglect. Now, plummeting rent payments from residents threaten to escalate the crisis in the nation's oldest, largest public housing system. More than 1,600 public housing agencies nationwide, from those in Richmond, Virginia to San Francisco, have faced a significant decrease in collections since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. As tenants lost work or spent more on cleaning supplies and other safety measures, when evictions were put on hold, people could miss payments without fear of losing their homes. Aid to help cover the mountain of back rent was sometimes confusing to access or left people in public housing out entirely, leaving local agencies to deal with the consequences. Yeah, so basically, when they put all the eviction protections and all the pandemic protections in place, right, they were like, oh, well, we're the government, we can't kick people out, right? And they suddenly were faced with the exact same problems that all the private landlords were facing, which was, hey, if we don't get paid the rent, we can't pay our own bills. We can't provide maintenance. But you know what? These public housing authorities were already being largely subsidized by the taxpayers, okay? Because they didn't make, you know what, the rents didn't pay for the maintenance on the buildings. The rents, even if they were collecting 100% of them, wouldn't pay for the capital expenditures, wouldn't pay for the upkeep. That's why these buildings are always in such bad disrepair. Okay, and then you have to go to the taxpayers every single time that you want to make improvements, and the taxpayers aren't feeling it. So yeah, this is a horrible, you know, just way to operate a landlord. You know, the government is a bad landlord. I'll just make it that simple. The government is a bad landlord, and since they are operating on a non-profit way, well, the buildings are going to be in bad shape. But nowhere has the phenomenon been as dire as in New York. The New York City Housing Authority collected just 65% of the rent it charged in 12 months leading up to December, the lowest percentage in the agency's nearly 100-year history, and an alarming slide from the annual pre-pandemic numbers of 90% or higher. It's just really a recipe for disaster. Lisa Bova Hyatt, who took over as CEO of the New York City Housing Authority on an interim basis in September, said in an interview. She added, "Without money, we can't do anything else. We can't fund the much needed repairs. We can't handle emergencies." How do they think that private landlords were dealing with it then? Okay? This is the exact same problem private landlords have been going through, through the entire pandemic, and the same problems that are in place due to all of the rent control measures that they implemented. Okay, if the New York City Housing Authority itself can't operate because they are just, so held back by, their stupid tenants who aren't paying rent, then what do they expect private landlords to do other than go out of business? So, yeah, they pointed all this out, right? And they pointed out that even before the pandemic, they actually had decent rent collections. But when they put these rules in place, you know what? Tenants are taking advantage of the situation. How can they not understand that? They need to go through and start evicting people, just kicking them out, because you know what? If you're not paying rent inside the public housing authority where your rent is hugely subsidized by the government, then you are abusing the system. You're taking advantage. Okay? And I believe tenants who aren't paying rent outside the public housing are taking advantage. Okay? So don't I just don't understand why there's such a disconnect between what the city government is saying and what their own experience is. Okay, can't the people from the housing authority go up to the mayor and be like, "Hey, look at this, we're getting our butts handed to us. Okay, we can't pay for anything because we aren't being allowed to evict anybody." The rent problems are a fresh setback for an institution that, despite its many troubles, is vital to New York, providing some of the few truly affordable homes in one of the nation's most expensive cities. New York City's housing authority's more than 270 developments are home to some 340,000 people. Yeah, it's big. It's the biggest housing authority in the entire country, right? 340,000 people live there in these super cheap, subsidized government housing, okay? Yet they're living in squalor. They're living in very bad conditions. And you know what? I feel bad for the people who do live there because they're like, they think that, the government's going to take care of us. Well, this is an important lesson about socialism, right? Government's not going to take care of you. They're going to give you the bare minimum for you to survive. What that means is elevators ain't going to be working. Your heat's going to be going out. The place is going to be overrun with crime. It's going to be falling into disrepair. Wouldn't have been updated in 20, 30 plus years, right? In a regular economy, what would have happened is the people who couldn't afford to live in New York City wouldn't be living in this government housing, right? They would have moved somewhere else where they could afford. That's what happens in a normal economy. But when you bring the government in, there's unintended consequences. Okay, so now we have 340,000 people in this, horrible situation inside this public housing. But the shortfall, amounting to almost $500 million, threatens to impede the agency's ability to repair faulty elevators and leaky roofs, run day-to-day operations, and do the huge amount of construction work required to address lead, mold, and other dismal conditions in thousands of apartments. That may prompt exacerbated residents to withhold rent. So yeah, basically because the tenants are withholding rent, the landlord can't do the repairs. But because the landlord's not doing repairs, more tenants are withholding rent. You see where this is, a vicious cycle that's created, right? This is part of the reason why I don't believe in those laws that say that, hey, tenants should be allowed to withhold rent if the landlord's not doing repairs. Well, where do you think we're getting the money to do the repairs? From the rent, dummies. So, the tenants, they think that they're doing something major by withholding the rent, but they're just really making their own situation worse. God, sometimes I just think that tenants are, they're just, I'll just say it like this: they're very self-centered. Okay, they don't think of anything else other than their own personal situation, which is why they want, their rents to remain low forever, regardless of whether the building's falling apart or not. So I'm going to skip down a little bit because in the article it actually mentions that the New York City Housing Authority is going to need a huge sum of money in order to get all the repairs done. New York's public housing system was once heralded as a progressive triumph, providing solid, stable homes for working class people. But dwindling funds, scandal, and mismanagement have made it the focus of one of the city's most urgent crises, and a high profile example of the effects of the federal government's retreat from housing. New York City Housing Authority estimates it needs a staggering $40 billion to return its developments to decent condition. Yeah, that's huge, okay? Basically, they need a huge sum of money in order to bring these housing projects back up to, a working standard, and they're not going to get it. They're not going to get it. Other than the federal government maybe bailing them out, I just don't see them suddenly saying, "Oh, we're going to raise taxes on all the people in the city so that these people over here can live for super cheap." That ain't going to happen. Okay, so you know what? They say it was a progressive triumph where working class people, and you know what? It just became worse and worse as time went by because the government's great at building projects. They're not great at maintaining them. Okay, over the long run. They had no plan for that. And you know what? That's part of the reason why we need private landlords. We need private landlords to stay there, and we need to allow them to make money. Okay, you have to allow them to be able to raise their rents and make money so they can keep their buildings up. Otherwise, we end up with problems like this. So I just wanted to highlight this story. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's pretty long. It is the New York Times, right? But basically, I wanted to go over the fact that, hey, socialized housing doesn't work. And this is the end result.